Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming out on a Saturday, on a balmy Saturday evening in greater Houston area. I do want to say that I don't know if any of you have been out here. David asked me a few years ago, I forget how many it was, about 4 or 5 maybe?
2019.
2019, so closer than that. So 4 years ago, it will be, to do a Spanish language version of the program here. So if you want to come back or bring somebody back who is a Spanish speaker, native Spanish speaker, you can hear me on that. I don't know why he asked me to do it, but I think he said it worked out well. So that's the first shameless plug for something I've been doing around here. I'll have a couple of other shameless plugs as we move along. The topic today, and by the way, the first Texas Revolution coincides with the Mexican War of Independence. So that's the first thing. Before I give my talk, which will be, I hope to entertain you. But if you're not entertained by what I have to say, you can look at the pictures and read the PowerPoint slides. And if there's any snoring, I expect the person next to you to give you a nice elbow. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and start. And this project is part of a series of things that I have been doing lately. In fact, a second shameless plug, I just, in the July issue of the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, I published an annotated and edited version of Erasmo Seguin's treason trial. He was accused of treason to the royal government in 1813. The case lasted until 1819. It's fascinating for what it has to say, not only about him, but about how royal justice worked, about the consequences of the Mexican War of Independence in Texas, a lot of different things. And so I'm working on Erasmo Seguin. I've been working on a couple of other figures from that period of time. It's a fascinating transitional figure, as you'll hear in what I have to say this evening. So, and at the end, I will mention, if you came here expecting that I was going to be talking about 1835, 1836, you will get that in either the last or the second to last sentence of tonight's talk. Up until that, my argument, which I'll lay again in the paper, but just to let you know what my argument is that we really can't understand the behavior of Tejanos in 1835, 1836, unless we understand where they came from and the consequences of the Mexican War of Independence for Tejanos was not only far-reaching in terms of physical, and by physical I mean deaths and exiles and loss of property, but also psychological. Because ultimately it went to the question of who are you? Are you a Spaniard? Then are you a Mexican? Then are you a Texan? And ultimately, you keep moving forward, are you an American? We have people like Erasmo Seguin who start off life being a Spanish subject, then they're a Mexican citizen, then they're a Republic citizen, then they're an American citizen. If you go to Jose Antonio Navarro, you go even further down the road. You start off being a Spanish subject, you go to being a Mexican citizen, you're going to a Republic citizen, then an American citizen, then a Confederate citizen, then back to being an American citizen. So imagine what that does to how you feel about how you fit into things, okay? So bear that in mind as I talk this evening. So in any case, as I said, this paper is part of my plunge into the Mexican War of Independence in local terms. Many years ago, I presented, here comes another shameless plug, many years ago I presented a paper at the Institute of Texan Cultures, and it was later published and then recently reissued in my collection of essays, Faces of Teja, Early San Antonio in Texas, which is out from A&M University Press. And it's a collection of my piece. It's kind of short stories about early Texas. I kind of consider myself, instead of a novelist, I consider myself a short story writer. Written a lot of articles and a lot of different things, but they sort of turn on central issues, and this is one of them. And that article, or that paper, was called Rebellion on the Frontier. And it was an early attempt to establish the circumstances and the motivations of Tejanos for participating in the two revolts of 1811 and through 1813. My long-term goal was, and remains, to produce a history of the Mexican War of Independence in Texas, focusing on the local population and stressing how the events in San Antonio were both part of a broader struggle, particularly in northeastern New Spain, what is now Mexico, and a reflection of the initial dynamics of community. My presentation today is a step in the direction of understanding Tejanos as a community on the eve of a new invasion, the Anglo-American settler migration of the 1820s. I'm not going to focus on what's been written on the two episodes of rebellion of the 18 teens and what led up to Mexican independence, most of which has centered on military and political issues. As far as conditions in San Antonio, after Royalist rule was restored in August 1813, historians have focused on the depleted nature of Spain's resources on the Texas frontier, which tends to serve the accepted narrative that Stephen F. Austin came to, quote, a howling wilderness. However, the wealth of documentation, both in Texas and Mexico, allows us a deeper understanding of the social and economic dimensions of the period, which is the goal of my project. I am not as far along in my research as I would like to be, particularly COVID closed archives made it difficult to get documentation, and of course there are all the interruptions that went with it. So today I'm offering kind of a sketch of the themes that I'm hoping to develop as the book project moves forward. There is no doubt as to the dire conditions in Spanish Texas generally following the Battle of Medina. San Antonio may have lost as many as 1,000 residents. Nacogdoches was almost completely abandoned. La Bahia also saw a considerable population decline, and the new settlements established under Governor Cordero between 1805 and 1808 had disappeared. Hardships and disasters went well beyond the military confrontations of 1812-1813. Continued insecurity created grim economic circumstances for almost everyone, even when the central government attempted to alleviate conditions. For instance, in fall of 1818, a relief convoy to Texas was stuck at the Rio Grande because a large number of desertions among the escort troops from Nueva Vizcaya. Likewise, the commanding general of the western provinces reported to the viceroy that a large number of desertions had taken place among troops headed for Texas, which he attributed to the effect on the morale of the reinforcements from the news that they heard of the privations experienced by the troops in the eastern provinces. And that reminds me of another story from earlier on. Governor Domingo Cabello, he was governor from 1778 to 1786. After his arrival in Texas, he wrote to one of his fellow officers complaining that his cook had abandoned him in Mexico City because he had heard that the Texas Indians would eat him. And Cabello said he couldn't fault the servant because Texas was worse than Siberia or Lapland. So Texas did not have a good reputation to begin with. It was a place of warfare with the Indians. It was a place of isolation. It was literally at the end of the line as far as the Spanish New Spain's Spanish Mexico was concerned. So a few months later, after that Commandant General of the Western provinces made his comments, the Viceroy attempted to send 15,000 pesos to cover some of the arrears in military payrolls. The money got only as far as Saltillo. There, the royal treasurer decided the best he could do, because of the danger of Indian attack, was to send word to the governor of Texas to send his own troops for the money or issue promissory notes against it. Which was a common thing. There was very little money circulating in Texas. So often what people did was they wrote promissory notes, IOUs, to each other for payment somewhere else. So it was rough. Living in Texas was rough. There we go. While numerous authors have documented the complaints of both governors and local officials regarding the military's plight and its effects on the community, there was more. In the middle years of the decade, smallpox killed many children, and Indian raids took the lives of numerous men, as well as some women and children. The province's wretched situation was such that it even drew the heartstrings of private parties. Following the disastrous flood of July 5, 1819, we don't have any official records from that period of time, but it appears to have been a hurricane that moved inland. And the torrential rains that fell in the San Antonio area flooded what was the center of town. If you think about the space between the Alamo and the governor's palace, that area in there, completely flooded out, homes swept away, people killed. It was horrible. And somebody as far away, a gentleman in Patas, which is on the southwestern end of Coahuila, so about 700 or 800 miles from San Antonio, sent 100 pesos for relief of the local population. In the middle of all of this was the government's reaction to the insurgency. The immediate aftermath of the August 18, 1813 Battle of Medina was, by all accounts, a particularly bloody time of retribution and terror. In San Antonio, days of summary executions gave way to a more orderly pursuit of punishment for those in the local population considered traitorous to the royal cause. 10 days after Medina, the remains of Governor Manuel Salcedo, the military commander Simon Herrera, and other Spanish royalists executed by the Republican Army of the North at the beginning of April were brought back to town and given Christian burial. On the same day, the newly appointed governor, Cristobal Dominguez, issued a proclamation ordering that citizens and soldiers who did not support the royalist cause at the battle surrender their arms, and that any documents distributed by the insurgents likewise be turned over. Moreover, and by the way, that among those documents were the letters that led to the accusations that Erasmo Seguin was a traitor. But that's for another story for another night. So if I do okay tonight, maybe they'll invite me back. I'll tell that story. Moreover, the houses, ranches, and other property belonging to the traitors were to be sold, quote, as equitably as possible in favor of those faithful patriots who remain steadfast in obedience to the sovereign, defending his sacred rights. And no disrespect to Queen Elizabeth, but my answer to the funeral and all the hoopla and all the news coverage here was, we fought a war to get away from those people, right? And Mexico fought a war to get away from those people as well, right? Although it is well documented that Arredondo and his officers acted harshly, particularly Benito Armiñan, who succeeded Dominguez as governor in late 1813. By the end of September, they appear to have begun acting within the rules emanating from Mexico City. In October, Arredondo issued an amnesty exempting only a handful of Tejanos. Juan Martín Beramendi, most of you may know him as the father of Ursula, who married Jim Boy. But he also went on to become the governor of Coahuila in Texas in 1832-33, before he died in a cholera epidemic. Francisco Arocha, Vicente Travieso, and Francisco Ruiz, who some of you may know. His famed claim was he was one of 2 Tejano signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence. But he was also a military figure, diplomat with the Indians. He was a school teacher. He did some legal work. A really talented man who went on to be the senator for Bear at the first Congress of the Republic. But he died early, 1840. Rather than summary execution, those arrested for rebellious activities after the reprisals following the Medina and not covered by an amnesty came under the military justice system. By March 1814, Tejareño loyalists felt secure enough in their control of the town that they requested that Arredondo have those citizens, quote, who may be suspected of upsetting the good of the nation be removed from here in order to achieve its total peace and tranquility. Singling out the Arocha clan in particular. By the end of the day, an alcalde had prepared a list of 32, quote, pardoned insurgents and suspicious families that may be prejudicial to the peace and quiet of this province. So, in other words, there was a certain amount of Tejano or Tejareño turning on others, right? Which is another interesting aspect of all of this, because at the end of the day, they all have to work together. And at the end of that note, he said that, quote, in addition to those listed, there are many others who I do not know if they are free under one of the various amnesties. Not on the list, and here's my talk on Erasmo, the other shameless play. Not on the list was Erasmo Seguin, who had been arrested and his property confiscated when he returned to San Antonio from Natchitoches, Louisiana in late 1813. He was charged with treason for writing letters of introduction for Jose Alvarez Toledo, who replaced Gutierrez de Lara as leader of the insurgency in July, just before the Battle of Medina. Seguin refused a pardon. He was tried, found guilty on appeal, and appealed again in a case that dragged on for almost 5 years before his exoneration. His case is one of numerous instances in which due process carried the day. And if you're interested, you can read the whole thing in the July issue of the Southwestern Historical Report. The pardons raised a separate issue for Tejareños. What about dead insurgents? Father Jose Dario Zambrano, San Antonio native, parish priest, and brother of leading local loyalist Juan Manuel Zambrano, made a formal request to Governor Armiñan on March 9, 1814, to provide Christian burial to the bodies still hanging in San Antonio's main plaza. The principal reason he offered for his request was that, quote, I cannot see that some men who have been deprived of their lives because of their crimes should lack Christian burial for so long, while others who committed the same crime have been forgiven, while the dead receive no mercy. He further lamented the disrespect with which the children in town were treating the bodies, quote, stoning them and derisively calling them names. So we don't know if Father Zambrano obtained the permission that he sought, but an examination of the parish burial register for 1813 and 1814 lacks entries consistent with church burials for the executed. So bodies may well have stayed there until they literally disintegrated into the ground of the plaza. Likewise, the Viceroy issued a general amnesty decree on December 22nd, 1815, for a period of 60 days for, quote, the rebels of this kingdom who present themselves voluntarily to enjoy clemency. And by 1816, the amnesty program was well established enough that individual pardons were issued on a pre-printed form. Even before the pardon program was regularized, Tejano rebels had begun to return to Texas, making Arredondo balance the need for pacification of the Texas frontier with population loss. As he explained to Viceroy Calleja in July 1815, he had ordered the release of most men returning from Louisiana, requiring that the authorities keep an eye on them and have them settle in the interior, because he did not think it, quote, convenient to lose so many men, and only those who were particularly bloodthirsty or served as ringleaders will be sent to Havana, and the top leaders beheaded if caught. And by sending to Havana, it doesn't mean that you went on a vacation there. It meant that you went there as a prisoner to work on the fortifications of the harbor. As it turned out, Arredondo turned out to be an even more generous than his assessment would indicate. Juan Martín Beramendi, for instance, one of the leaders of the insurgency during the time of the First Republic, not only did not leave Texas after being pardoned, but went on to completely exonerate himself and his brothers, despite considerable evidence against him. Nevertheless, even repentant minor rebels were cautious in turning themselves in. And Jose Maria Arocha declared that he had not returned to San Antonio previously because he did not have the means to do so. And, quote, because the first amnesty that he found out about applied only to Nacogdoches, and that the citizens of this place, that is San Antonio, it was assured, were not pardoned. And so he did not want to expose himself. But later, when he verified that it did apply, he determined to present himself in this city as soon as he had the means to undertake the journey. So, in other words, they were hearing rumors, but they didn't trust the authorities, and so they wanted to make sure that they were going to get a fair hearing. Pardons, then, were not routine actions, but followed a prescribed form and were handled on a case-by-case basis. As Claudio Hernandez, alias Corazon, that means heart, found out to his regret. When he encountered a cavalry troop returning to La Bahia from San Antonio late in 1815 and was taken to San Antonio, he was jailed on charges of insurgency and other crimes. He admitted to having fled to the United States with the rebels following the Battle of Medina. He had stayed in Natchitoches since then, coming to San Antonio only once in 1814 in the company of 3 others for the purpose of taking advantage of the amnesty. But having been betrayed, he went back to Natchitoches, from which he made his second attempt. In this new effort to take advantage of an amnesty, he argued that he had presented himself to the soldiers, not captured by them. As the investigation dragged on, evidence mounted that Hernandez had a reputation as a, quote, bad man. Eventually, the judge advocate found that Hernandez, who had once again broken jail, should be exempted from the amnesty because of his criminal behavior, although he would have otherwise qualified. Turned out Hernandez was a thief, had committed various crimes, and was generally rather low life. So nobody was going to pardon him for anything. Following the announcement of a new general amnesty in 1817, even men who had actively participated as officers in the 1813 revolt came forward to take advantage. For instance, Pedro Procela, who had joined Gutierrez de Lara at Nacogdoches, participated in the siege of La Bahia, and fought at the battles of Alazan and Medina, presented himself to Governor Antonio Martinez on August 27, 1817, requesting a pardon. Although he made excuses about his participation, alleging that he had feared assassination by the insurgents if his plans to abandon them were discovered, he did not try to hide his actions or justify his appointment as a captain in the Republican Army of the North, probably because the governor rounded up witnesses to his actions. It took almost 2 years for the judge advocate to find that Rosella fell under the provisions of the amnesty and for Arredondo to accept the findings, which included a provision that Rosella relocate out of Texas. Despite the pacification that Arredondo talked about and the role played by general amnesties, the insurgency continued. Other authors have written about the operations of Vicente Travieso and Vicente Tarin and Francisco Ruiz. What has not been researched is how these operations were funded and how these rebels interacted with the Tejanos living under Spanish rule. In fall 1815, Beja resident Vicente Duran encountered a group of Tejano insurgents near town, from whom he learned that Toledo, Gutierrez de Lara, and Robinson were preparing a campaign against the province. He also learned that they had been procuring horses as far south as the towns along the Rio Grande to raise funds in the United States. As a result, in November 1815, Arredondo issued an order preventing the residents of the Villas del Norte, that is the towns along the lower Rio Grande, it's that time of year, but in Texas, all year is that time of year. Arredondo issued orders preventing the residents of the Villas del Norte, that is the towns along the lower Rio Grande, from Laredo down to today's Matamoros, from selling horses and mules without notifying the authorities and providing information on who the animals were being sold to and where they were destined, since many were winding up in the United States in support of the insurgency. Duran's declaration also raised the issue of the loyalty of the Tejano population to the royalist order. As Arredondo concluded in a letter dressing down Governor Mariano Varela for inaction, it appeared that the rebel agents were to be regularly found in the town's vicinity, and some had actually stayed in residents' homes. Arredondo's tendency toward draconian remedies then showed itself in his order to Varela that if the rebels invaded Texas in force, such that the troops in the province could not defeat them, the governor was to carry out a general withdrawal, including the civilian population under the military's protection. Quote, "It should be understood that neither there nor in La Bahia should anything be left behind that might serve the needs of the rebels, and that those individuals who do not withdraw to the interior of the provinces or who may flee to the countryside or ranches will be treated for such actions as rebels and accomplices of our enemies." Clearly, despite the population's efforts to demonstrate its loyalty, the continued presence of insurgents and former rebels made Tejanos as a whole suspect, an attitude that would arise again 20 years later during the Texas Revolution. In fact, one of Travis's letters during the siege talks about how the Tejano population of San Antonio can't be trusted. They ran. I sort of skipped this one, sorry about that. But there's one of these decrees for the confiscation of goods. As in the case of amnesty, the confiscation of rebel property in Texas was not a unique or isolated event. Confiscations were part of the government strategy both to punish insurgents and to raise funds for the war. Yes. To raise funds for the war against them throughout the Viceroyalty. By 1814, the Viceroy had issued a general confiscation decree. But in Texas, Arredondo had already ordered the confiscation of rebel property in October of 1813. Almost at the same time that he announced the first amnesty. A committee of loyalist Tejanos was appointed to oversee the seizures, appraisal, and sales, and an administrator then kept the records, which extended through late 1819. Unfortunately, time does not permit an in-depth discussion of the confiscation program, but a couple of generalizations are possible in regards to it. In the first years following the confiscations, few of the property sold. Some, such as Erasmo Seguin's house, which became a school, were put to public use before eventually being returned to him. In the case of Vicente Travieso, his wife Luisa de Luna was able to get Arredondo to turn over one of the smaller confiscated dwellings as a shelter for her and her sizable family after the seizure of their main house. Because 4 inventories of for the period between 1813 and July 1819 exist, and because there is also a record of the final general auction from November 1819, it is possible to say that not only was it impossible for many residents to afford paying the appraisal price for the properties, but most of the confiscated structures suffered serious deterioration. So this one here is one of the many letters discussing these various issues. The flood of 1819 appears to have been the last straw. The flood waters carried away several of the confiscated dwellings and completed the ruin of many of those that are already in an advanced state of disrepair. Arredondo authorized an auction of the remaining seized properties, which Governor Martinez carried out in November. The auction appears to have presented an opportunity for some of the town's more enterprising citizens. Although not all of the property sold, those which did went for significantly less than their appraised value. For instance, Manuel Iturri bought Francisco Rocha's house appraised at 5,858 pesos, which was a princely sum of money then, in 1814, for 2,025 pesos, so much less than half. In many cases, it appears that the owners of neighboring properties took advantage of the opportunity to expand their holdings. Domingo Bustillos picked up the stone ruins of Jose Manuel Delgado and Francisco Rodriguez, valued at 300 and 250 pesos, which were largely fallen in even before the flood, for 13 and 10 pesos respectively. There is also the case of Pedro Longville, whose plot of land and 6 hours of irrigation water, valued at 50 pesos, he was able to buy back. He'd been accused of being a rebel, so his property had been confiscated, so he turns around and buys it back. He bought it back for 42 pesos. Oops. Beyond the legalities, there you go. Beyond the legalities of confiscating rebel property, there was also the question of property commandeered by the inhabitants, particularly provisions. In May 1814, Maria Josefa Zambrano, wife of Francisco Montes, filed a complaint with the governor that Lieutenant Jose Maria Navarra, under instructions from Arredondo, had gone to the lower ranches to gather cattle for the army's march to Laredo. She claimed he had taken more than 200 head, the only means of subsistence for her large family. After what appears to have been an earnest investigation, the governor reported to Arredondo that her claims could not be substantiated, and Arredondo decided that, quote, her complaint having been found to be false and unfounded, you will make her understand my order that if she repeats such an offense, she will receive the punishment prescribed for false accusers and slanderers. In fall 1818, the Intendente at San Luis Potosí, and the Intendente was the chief financial officer for a large region during the colonial period, whose authority extended to Texas, sent an order requiring that anyone having suffered a loss as a result of, quote, Anglo-American invasion, present an affidavit to the effect in order to provide, quote, an exact accounting to the Viceroy and he to His Majesty of the damages caused to the province by the Anglo-Americans and their agents. Misidentified in the Bear Archives as petitions for loss of property, they were, in fact, statements of losses. Each declaration was accepted under oath by Béjar's second alcalde, none other than the Baron of Bastrop, who had settled in San Antonio in 1806. Quote, for its greater lawfulness, ordering that this document be archived so that it may serve at all times as a true record. And a true record it is. Very interesting stuff. In response to the order, between October 10 and November 30th, 1818, 130 citizens of San Antonio, including residents at missions San Jose, Capistrano, and Espada, presented themselves to document their material losses since the start of the Gutierrez-Magee Expedition. Their claims ranged from Gregorio Zapata's 12 pesos for the loss of a gun to Ignacio Perez's 46,140 pesos in livestock, money paid to rebels, belongings lost in battle, and even a coach worth 500 pesos. It was the second highest total behind only Juan Manuel Zambrano's 61,474 pesos. A number of the claims came from widows or wives. Some of them, the spouses of rebels or former rebels. For instance, Maria Josefa Navarro, wife of exonerated rebel Juan Martín Beramendi, presented an elaborate petition that declared, quote, all the property lost since the year 1812, when the intruding Anglo-Americans made an attempt against this province. In other words, this petition, and many of the others, laid the blame for the rebellion at the feet of the foreigners. It's just a smart move, right? You're going to blame somebody, blame the guys who are gone. Father Jose Dario Zambrano, who was serving as parish priest, presented his losses from, quote, the revolution of the Americans when they entered the city of San Fernando de Béjar. And he divided his losses between those up to Arredondo's recovery of the province and the losses to Indians afterwards. Other statements also included losses to Indian raiding, and in other words, for Bejareños, the consequences of the insurgency were ongoing and broad and required acknowledgement. So not only was there devastation that came as a direct result of the warfare, but there was also further devastation because the warfare left the province unable to, or the military unable to protect the province from the Indians. There. In the surviving statements, what Bejareños reported reflected community, social, and economic dynamics. Some examples will show the range of losses and indicate the thinking of the Affians. Beramendi's losses provide a good idea of the entrepreneurial nature of some Bejareños. The losses began with the capture of a shipment of wool during the initial stages of the Gutierrez-Magee Expedition. According to Navarro, her husband had lost 1,192 arrobas, about 30,000 pounds of wool, worth 7,146 pesos, and 42 tame and well-harnessed mules that were carrying the wool, as well as various amounts paid to a handful of individuals. for a total of 9,476 pesos. The Beramendi losses were even more impressive for the period between the capture of San Antonio by Gutierrez-Magee and the Battle of Medina, including over 1,000 head of cattle, more than 2,000 sheep and goats, well over 100 horses and mules, and the debts owed by 6 ranch hands for a total of 11,115 pesos. Navarro then rounded out the documentation of losses by recording, quote, the house furnishings and goods lost when the house was confiscated by order of his lordship, Commandant General Don Joaquin de Arredondo, who, ill-informed, considered my husband an accomplice in the crime of insurrection. Well, he wasn't ill-informed, but Beramendi managed to get out from under it. The items included 150 arrobas of goat fat, goat skins, crystal and china, and even a trunk of Beramendi's clothing totaling over 1,000 pesos. In all, Navarro reported, always tending toward a value lower than might be the case, 21,666 pesos, 5 reales in losses, which her husband might need to adjust later. Although we must at least be, we have to be somewhat skeptical of the overall size and value of these inventories, obviously, but there is no doubt that substantial wealth was lost by many Tejanos. By the way, it is the structure, as it was destroyed in it's a shame because this was probably, including the governor's palace, this was probably the most handsome home in San Antonio in the late colonial period. But as you can see, time did not treat it very kindly. And by 1909, it was in complete disrepair, and at the beginning of the 20th century saw some urban renewal in San Antonio, and the Beramendi Palace paid the price. Among a group of statements submitted on November 9 that included both loyalists and former rebels or their families, that of Tomasa Perez, widow of Cayetano Dominguez, stands out, as she started her statement by citing the loss, quote, first, my husband and one of my sons killed. Her claim of a jacal and tract of farmland, the value of which was deducted from the total she presented, indicates that her husband was on the insurgent side. Manuel Barrera reported the rebels' destruction of improvements he had made at his ranch and the debts of peons who had fled to the insurgents. Alejandro Courier and his sister Antonia presented separate statements in which they noted the property they had lost, attempting to flee the city to join the royalists. And Lieutenant Jose Salinas reported among his losses 64 pesos owed to him by a servant, quote, who fled with the Anglo-Americans with his Mexican musket. In fact, it appears that quite a few servants, identified either as mozos or peones, took the opportunity to liquidate their debts with their employers, either by joining the insurgency or by fleeing. Subdeacon Juan Manuel Zambrano, the town's most prominent loyalist, excepting perhaps Ignacio Perez, reported losing 3,360 pesos, 3 reales, from the, quote, cowboys, shepherds, and personal peons who died in the war or fled. In a couple of instances, a servant's flight added insult to injury. For example, Jose Gil of Mission Capistrano, the alcalde of Mission Capistrano, claimed 25 pesos for, quote, a saddled and bridled horse that a servant took. So not only the servant fled, but the servant fled with his horse. And then he added the 25 pesos that the servant owed him. In all, 21 of the 130 statements referred to servants who had absconded, owing their employers money. In the singular case of Valerio Labam, the servants whose loss he reported were enslaved individuals, including 3 children, one as young as 3 years old. The value of all 6 totaling 960 pesos. So we see that the independence struggle could be especially personal to some, including peones in debt and the enslaved. They have left us a record of what they thought of their actions, of what they thought in their actions by fleeing when the opportunity arose. A number of features of the events of the period stand out in helping us to better understand the subsequent attitudes and behaviors among Tejanos during the Texas Revolution period. It is clear from the documentation that although faced with the singular challenges owing to its location on what was in effect a double frontier with autonomous Indian peoples on the one hand and the United States on the other, Texas was intrinsically part of New Spain's northern frontier culture, economy, and politics. The continued loyalty of significant portions of the population and the ability of to reintegrate many quote-unquote repentant rebels suggests the strong hold that the Spanish-Mexican identity had on the people. The importance to Tejanos of a diverse livestock economy that included cattle, horses, mules, and wool, something that I only marginally talked about today, was considerable. Was a considerable source of wealth for a small proportion of the population, but a big part of the employment of people in the San Antonio area on both sides. That small minority resembled the Mexican, the small minority that benefited the most, resembled the Mexican hacendado class in some respects. For instance, in having peones or peons in debt to them. The ability of loyalists and some former insurgents to quickly assume a measure of control over the town's affairs parallels actions elsewhere in the viceroyalty and shows the growing sense of local will that came to play an important role as Tejanos defended their local interests in the decades to follow, just as other Mexicans attempted to forge strong regional governments. It appears, in fact, that proven loyalists may have actively sheltered or protected defeated insurgents. In other words, the seeds of federalism, which became a guiding principle of leading Tejanos, developed out of the community's responses to the revolutionary decade. Finally, their increasing interactions with the Anglo-Americans created bonds and established networks that long preceded Moses and Stephen F. Austin. And so let me say that in a different way. Tejanos had extensive contacts with Louisiana well before Stephen F. Austin came along. We want to center what happens in Texas after 1821 on Stephen F. Austin. And part of my argument is that's Monday morning quarterbacking.
Yeah.
That's projecting what happens in 1835 as what's going on in 1821, and that's not the case. In 1821, in 1825, even as late as 1830, Tejanos are still in control of Texas, and it's a control that they fought hard to develop during the previous decade. The loss of control that happens is a gradual one, so that by 1835, Anglo-Americans have become dominant. But if you look back in time, that doesn't happen until fairly late. Thus, the decade of revolutionary challenges prepared Tejanos to take on the challenges of independence and make them comfortable in dealing with Americans. In other words, for the Tejanos, the Americans were just part of life on the northeastern frontier. They're not. They don't expect them to take over. In other words, that's not the expectation of what's going to happen. Agustín de Iturbíde's Plan de Iguala, the independence program that guaranteed the status of the Catholic Church, Mexico's political independence from Spain, and the union of all Mexicans, was sworn in San Antonio in July 1821. It allowed for Tejanos on both sides of the independence struggle to attempt to mend the torn social and economic fabric of the province. Insurgents such as Francisco Ruiz, who had been leaders in their communities before 1812, joined royalists such as Jose Antonio Salcedo, who had been running things since Arredondo's recapture of the province in 1813, to begin working together for a better future. There were hard feelings, especially in cases where property seized at various times by insurgents and by the royal government had yet to find its way back into the hands of their rightful owners. But in general, Tejanos worked to find opportunities for promoting the province's progress. Those who had interactions with Anglo-Americans during the Revolutionary decade saw the orderly immigration of people from the United States as a way of quickly improving conditions. They, of course, had no way of knowing that their loyalties would once again be tested, their property again subject to seizure, and their place in the new Texas questioned after 1836. Thank you very much.